Last week we discussed options for ripping and/or importing files from DVD. And this week we're going to continue that discussion. Hi, this is Jim Todd with Video Surgeon, and in this weekly video tip we're going to discuss and demonstrate the options that you have for saving the pieces of a large file that are of interest to you. In other words, if you look at the file on my screen, it's about a gigabyte file. It was ripped from a DVD. So whether you have ripped something from a DVD or you've downloaded something from the internet that's very large or very long, instead of storing a gigabyte of data on your machine, you're going to want to store only those parts of the file that are of interest. So how do we do that and get rid of everything else? That's the topic, and that's what we're going to explore today. Your first step once you open a large file is obviously to identify those parts or pieces that are of interest to you. And in this particular case, I've used looping areas to do that. And so for purposes of illustration for this video, we're going to work with these looping areas and just assume that these are three separate areas within this very large 27-minute video that we want to save. So the question becomes, how do you most efficiently do that? And there are really three ways that I can think of. The first two ways involve using the looping functions found in the export command. And if we go up here, we see in the export drop-down we have export the current loop or export all loops. And these are the two we're going to be focusing upon. So in the first scenario, we're going to export a single loop at a time. So we select a loop by putting the progress indicator inside of it. That means that this loop becomes selected. Then we go up here to export. We're going to export the current loop, which is the one we've selected, and we could call this loop 1. And then we would select the OK button, and that would export this file and create a new file with only this data in it. We would then move this selector to loop 2, select it by placing the blue progress indicator inside of it, go up to export, export the current loop, give it a name, we could call it loop 2, export it, and then we would move it to loop 3 and we would do the same. Now the advantages of this are that you have three different pieces of data on the screen that you're interested in, and this allows you to save each piece of data separately in its own file. And that means that in the future when you go to open it, you have these pieces of data separate. You might want to apply different tempos or different pitches or do things with them that make it most convenient to have them in separate files. So that's the plus here. The negative or the downside of this is that you've got to perform this operation 3 times. You've got to select each loop, go up here and export it individually. So there is a second option that you have from this export box, and that is to export all loops. And if you did that, you could call this all loops and click OK, and it would export the data in these 3 loops. Now let me be specific about what it would do. It would basically take all the data in front of this loop and delete it. It would take all the data in between this loop and delete it. And it would take all the data in between the second and third loop and delete it, and then it would take all the data at the end and delete it. So what would be left would be just these 3 loops, and it would put these 3 loops back to back. So when you export with all loops, all you're going to have left is the data in these 3 loops, and the data is going to be put back to back, and there's going to be no space in between the data. So it's a quicker function because you only have to go through it once, but the downside of it is that you've got all the data in a single file and it's back to back, and you may not want it that way. Now you have a third option, and I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but you could actually use the editing functions over here. And what you could do, just to show you one brief example of this, you could select all the data in front of this loop. You could select all the data between these loops, and at the end, and you could delete it. So for instance, I've selected just the area in front of this first loop. We click delete, and now that data disappears. So those are the options that you have for saving pieces of data in these large files. And of course, once you've saved the data that you've identified in these 3 different segments, then you can go to wherever the original file is stored, this 1 gigabyte file on your machine, and you can delete it. And for management of space purposes, that's probably a smart thing to do. So that's going to conclude this weekly video tip.